Teachers, as you come back this school year, we would like to show you how each and every one of you has had such a big impact on us.
Miss Nicholas.
Mr. Camillo.
Mr. Coggins.
Mr. Ditkin.
Mr. Johnson.
Senora Williams.
Senora Barrett.
Senora Wolf.
Miss Bennett. Mr. Yards.
Mr. Lisa.
Mrs. Rude.
Senora Yoli.
Mrs. Vore.
Mr. Fagan.
Mrs. Lynch.
Mr. Riker.
You push students to limits they never knew were possible.
Mr. Serger. Mr. Swatchko.
Mrs. Moorhead.
Mrs. Roebuck. Mrs. Parker.
Mr. Winkler.
Mr. Kilgore.
Mrs. Pittenger.
Mr. Underwood.
Mr. Paul.
Mr. Desmond.
Mr. Gillespie.
Miss Jason. Mrs. Carrier. Mr. Wall.
Mr. Cincinnati.
Mr. Cameron.
Miss Catterson. Your influence can never be erased. Miss Kirkland. Miss Raymond. Mrs. McSwain. Miss McKinney. Mrs. Von Hove.
Mrs. Carpenter.
Mr. Meyer.
Miss Lynch.
Miss Wilson.
Mr. Tucker. Mrs. Metzger. Mr. Dumfries. Mr. Despennon.
Miss Ackerman.
Mrs. Porter.
Mrs. Kaufman.
Mrs. Homer.
Miss de Blasio.
What you teach today may someday light the world.
Mr. Mensker.
Mrs. Friesenberg.
Mrs. English. Mrs. Lyden.
Mrs. Davidson.
Schunglasher. Frau Goff.
Mrs. Norsworthy.
Mr. Lutz.
Mr. Crowell. Mrs. Teskey.
Senora West.
Mrs. O'Neill. Mr. Ackerman.
You inspire hope, ignite the imagination, and spark a love for learning.
Mr. Leeper.
Mr. Smith.
Mr. Shaker.
Mrs. Hartley.
Mrs. Emmons.
Mr. Shepard.
Mrs. Chandler.
Mrs. Houghton.
Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Gregory.
Miss Woods.
Mr. Rose. Mrs. Dolezal.
Mr. Jacob.
Miss Walsh.
Teachers plant seeds of knowledge that last a lifetime.
Miss Ball.
Mrs. Panko. Mr. Bernetti.
Dr. Daly.
Mr. Fritz. Mrs. Candy. Mrs. Baker.
Mr. Parks.
Mr. Crossan.
Mr. Coombs.
Senora Halcomb.
Mrs. Downey.
Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Helms. Mr. Bart.
Mrs. Wolford.
Mrs. Zatek. Mr. Smith.
Mr. Jordan.
Mrs. McDonough. Mrs. Wiseman. Miss Wilkin.
Mrs. Arbor.
Mr. Klaus. All new teachers starting their Milford journey.
You change the world, one student at a time.